Hello, everyone, and on behalf of STAND, a nonprofit organization with a mission to inspire, educate, and activate third-level students to stand up for global justice, equality, and sustainability, I would like to welcome you to our Elephant in the Room bite-sized webinar and podcast series. I'm Kat, and I'll be your student host for the whole series. So with this series, we aim to create space for honest conversations around the most pressing topics of our time, topics that are possibly uncomfortable and intimidating to address, but are too important to ignore. It is important to note that we don't have all the answers. It will also be difficult to take a neutral stance, but we have chosen to feature knowledgeable and interesting speakers who align with STAND's values of global justice, sustainability, and equity. Some speakers will give a critical overview of the issues, while others will use the stories and pull on their lived experiences. We really hope that their contribution will initiate the conversations and spark some insights. It's also absolutely fine if you disagree with what you hear. We'd love to hear from you, so please do keep the conversations going. So let's head to today's session, which is the third one of this series. It's called The Elephant That Took a Hard Right. And we have our guest speaker here, Vittorio Bufacchi, with us. So a little bit about him. Vittorio completed his PhD at the London School of Economics under the supervision of Professor Brian Barry. He has taught at several institutions across the UK, US, and Ireland, which includes the University of Manchester, Yale University, University College Dublin, University College Cork, among many others. His research focuses on key areas of political philosophy, including social justice, the ethics of violence, the philosophy of human rights, and the political theory of secure. To date, Vittorio has authored 8 books, with his work translated into many languages like Chinese, Spanish, Polish, Italian, and he also contributed opinion pieces to major media outlets such as the Irish Times, the Irish Examiner, the Guardian, the Business Post, and RT Brainstorm. So thank you, Vittorio, for joining us today. Maybe we can start with just the first question about the far right. So can you just tell us a little bit about the far right and what are its features?
Yes, so thank you, Kat, for inviting me. Indeed, the far right is something that we need to talk about. And sometimes you get the impression that people think that this is a new thing, that it's a new phenomenon, and it certainly is not. Some form of the far right have always been part of politics. And that's because wherever there is a democracy, there will always be attempts to undermine or delegitimize a democracy. Now, why is that? I think because one of the pillars of democracy is equality. So when you have a democracy, you have a system of equal rights, you have equal citizenship, you have equality under the law, you have, morally speaking, a sense of equal concern and respect for everyone. The far right is undermining that. It's quintessentially the political philosophy of inequality. So one of the premises of the far right is that there is no such thing as equality of rights or citizenship, and certainly there is no equality of concern and respect for others. Now, let's be slightly more precise. The far right is authoritarian. And so what that means is that there is a belief in social and political hierarchies. There's this idea that we're not all equal, that some people are better than others, and they do believe in a social and political pyramid. Now, going back in history, there was a belief that such inequalities were very much part of nature, and the far right embraces those inequalities that it claims exist in nature itself. And these have taken different forms over the centuries, but there are some prevalent ones that keep coming back. And so racial inequalities, ethnic inequalities, religious inequalities, and also gender inequalities. And there is a belief that there is a form that such inequalities are natural and therefore should be embraced. So, what are the features that really distinguish the far right? First of all, there is this strong belief in inequality, or if you like, a belief against equality. There are natural social hierarchies, and they're often based on bizarre, obsolete scientific views, or so they claim, about gender and race. And this is what gives the far right an outlook in sexist, misogynistic, and racist positions. The other feature which stands out is nationalism, extreme nationalism, patriotism. They utilize this ethno-nationalist roots. And again, there is a claim of nature there, sort of a biological status. There is an assumption of ethnic purity, which is good. And then there is the corrupting influence of the others, which are bad. So take the example of someone who really, at the moment, represents the far right in Europe, the Prime Minister of Italy, Giorgia Meloni. And she will say, I am pro-Europe, but that's a Europe that is white, that it's Christian, and they want to defend that ethnic, religious claim about what Europe is and defend it from corrupting infiltrations. And from this, there's also a kind of a really dangerous sort of gender issue here, and misogyny, because it becomes a duty of women to continue this pure ethnic line. And men are supposed to stop the outsiders from coming in and contaminating the biological pool. And this is why there is a reason why far-right political parties are strongly against abortion, because they want to reproduce the race that they claim to be superior. So these are some of the key features.
Yeah, thank you so much for just a very quick definition and also like examples. It really kind of pinpoint like what far right is, at least like according to you, like the definitions you are familiar with, from your field of expertise. So maybe move on to the second question. Then what do you think is the difference between far right and fascism?
Yes, so you often hear people use the term fascism whenever they talk about the far right. Now, the far right has been around for centuries, and it's gone through many permutations. And fascism is just one of them. And I think there are important differences between the far right and fascism, far right as we understand it today in the 21st century, and fascism. But there are also some similarities. So starting with the differences. So fascism is specifically a historical period. It's a phenomenon in history which started in Italy at the turn of the 20th century. And this is when people were looking back at the Roman Empire, and they saw the Roman Empire as a possible role model for the 20th century. Even the term dictator, it's actually a term used, it's a Latin term that was used in ancient Rome. So when Julius Caesar took power and he killed off the Roman Republic, and the Roman Republic was a form of democracy. There was citizenship, there were rights, there were elections, there was rule of law, there was a constitution. And in 45 BC, Julius Caesar killed it off and replaced it with himself. And he gave himself a title, Dictator Perpetuo, perpetual dictator. And the idea here is what you need to solve the problems of society is one strong man. And I say man because there's something very masculine and toxic masculinity in the far right to fix all the problems, and politics and constitutions and rule of law, they just get in the way. So Italian fascism 100 years ago, they kind of had one goal: make Rome great again. They were looking back at Rome. Let's make Rome great again. So there are a few. So when we talk about fascism, we're talking about that experiment. And 21st century far right parties, they're not thinking about ancient Rome. They're not thinking about Julius Caesar. But there is something they have in common with fascism, with Mussolini, even with Julius Caesar. And this is really interesting because it's the method of politics. The far right believes that violence is legitimate, that it is okay to use violence, that politics is not the alternative to violence, but politics is using violence. And so using violence as a political method, that's a far right prerogative. That is a common denominator with every form of far right over the years. But there is something there is this virility, there is this toxic masculinity, there is this claim that it's okay to use violence. Why? Because we're doing it for a good cause, we're doing it for a nation, we're doing for something that is pure.
Thank you so much for sharing. It's really interesting to see how it all dates back to history and how we still see this today. And so just one final question. So what do you think we can do to stem the tide of the far right?
Right. So I think the far right is gaining momentum. I thought it was bizarre when people in Ireland kept saying, oh, look what's going on in Italy and France and Spain and the Netherlands, but it will never happen in Ireland. Of course it was going to happen. So there is a question here. How do you deal with it? How do you respond to this challenge? And I think there are two possible strategies. And the first one, I think, is the wrong strategy, which is to fight fire with fire. So the far right accuses all of us of all sorts of bad things, and we respond by calling them names, by calling them fascists. And if they use violence against us, then we should be prepared to use violence against them. I don't think this is the right way to go about it. Because the problem is that if you do that, you're acknowledging their significance. And the far right, they love to play the card of being the victims. We are now being threatened by these immigrants. We're becoming a minority, and it's so. You don't want to do that. You don't want to legitimize their methods. And the best thing we can do is to make them insignificant. They want to fight, but you shouldn't take the bait. In social media, they are extremely abusive. I'm at the receiving end of a lot of it most of the time. I never reply. I just block them. That's because once you engage with them, you legitimize their position and you give them political oxygen. Now, very, very quickly, because I come from philosophy, there is actually a philosophical reason why I think it's important not to engage with them at their level. And this goes back to a philosopher called Carl Schmitt. He was writing in the 1920s and 30s in Germany. He was openly sympathetic to Nazism. And he said one thing about politics, which unfortunately we have to take seriously. He says, politics is the existential distinction between friend and enemy. And if you start to look at politics in terms of friend and enemy, then everything turns into war. It's agonistic. It's all about us and them. And we are good and pure, the other is bad. And I think that's exactly what we should avoid. It's avoiding this rhetoric of us and them, avoiding this way of thinking, which is kind of a binary dichotomy. And I think that's what they want. And so I think we should find a way of resisting it, because actually we believe that politics is about compromise and toleration and respect and care. And it's not about othering, because that's exactly what they're trying to do. And I think that's really dangerous, because if you go down that route, then it's warfare. And that's what should be avoided.
Thank you so much, Vittorio. I think there are also some questions if you would be happy to answer. So there's the person asking, what about the softer anti-immigrant sentiments in Ireland that you might hear from relatives around the dinner table? I'm not sure you would classify it as far right, but how can you start to communicate around this issue in a useful way that helps create less division?
I think that's a great question. It's a great question. There is a phenomenon that actually has a name in philosophy of language, which is the phenomenon of fig leaves. When people say, oh, I'm not a racist, but ... And the far right often uses that kind of language. Or they would say, I've heard that the majority of violence in society is done by immigrants. I've read somewhere, and that's just a fig leaf, right? Whether they did or not, whether it's true or not, they're putting it out there. And one of the strategies of the far right is actually to undermine our conception of the truth. The politics of post-truth, now that's for another discussion because it's a big topic. But there is the sense in which if you start to delegitimize the truth and you start to create an atmosphere where every opinion is as valid as any other opinion, and all you have to say is, well, I heard that somewhere that these are nasty people. Or, of course, I'm not a racist, but all these immigrants, so on and so forth. I think sometimes people don't realize that they're actually using the language of the far right. And in a sense, that's even worse because the so-called fascist is easy to spot and it's easy to deal with them in some ways, or easy to ignore. It's actually that their language has infiltrated our society. So what should we do? Which is the question. You know, you're here at the dinner table, you hear, people in your family. You don't call them names. You don't antagonize them. You say, well, where did you hear that? Because that's not what I've heard. That's not true. You have to sort of, you engage in polite conversation, which is what democracy is. Philosophy started as dialogues, Plato and ours, they were all writing dialogues. A dialogue implies equality. I listen to you, you listen to me, we learn from each other. And when you hear those things, you have to sort of hold back your temptation to bite their heads off, but engage with them and say, well, when you say I'm not a racist, but actually what you're saying sounds like racist, and make them realize. Because sometimes I think people fall into it, not realizing it. It's not easy.
Thanks so much for your response, Vittorio. It's indeed a difficult situation to navigate, especially when it's come to conversation with friends and family, because it's quite a sensitive topic in a way. We do have another question. Would it be fair to say that in some situations, such as that of Argentina, the rise of Malay and the far right is not the result of any particular belief or preference for a particular political system, but a desperation to get out of bleak situation by opting for any alternative to a status quo?
Yes, no, that's very good, and it's interesting because again, when you consider Argentina, it is a very different scenario, and which is why I think terms like fascism don't always apply, but there is something there, and there's certainly something about the far right. The thing is, inequality breeds inequality. So if you create a system where there are inequalities, and there are some people who are in a desperate position because of those inequalities, social but specifically economic inequalities, there is a risk that they will respond by looking for more inequalities, but inequalities that actually puts them in a position of power. So it's in societies that are more egalitarian, it's hard for the far right to actually find a place to grow. And if we look at the United States, which of course, we're going to have a big election coming up in a few weeks. But one of the things that Donald Trump has managed to do is to mobilize the people who felt they were not being represented, that they had no place in society. Not all of them, but certainly a chunk of them who feel that, okay, maybe this person is going to give me a voice, the others didn't. And there are obscene inequalities in American society, just like there are inequalities in Argentina. So yes, I think there is an issue of actually acknowledging that actually, if people are desperate, they will possibly be attracted to the far right. Maybe you need to deal with that desperation, that inequality to start with. Because that's exactly what happens. And we don't really know what's going to happen in Argentina, but it's not looking good. I mean, he's just started his program, and it could turn nasty, just like it could turn nasty in Italy. And we know that someone like Orban in Hungary, he's been there long enough to have done serious damage. So maybe the best cure against the far right is to create a society where inequalities are dealt with, and we haven't done a good job of that.
Thank you so much, Vittorio. Just maybe a very quick question. Do you have any advice on what can a student do, or like in organizations we can get involved with in order to resist the rise of binaries and hate?
Yes, excellent question. Get involved. Where the far right or historically fascism really found fertile ground is where there was political apathy, where people weren't bothered with it. One of the things that I detest most is when people say, I can't be bothered with politics, they're all the same. No, they're not. They're not all the same. There is a difference in the American election depending on who becomes the next president. In Argentina, there was a difference. Politics matters. Who you have in power matters. And so if you have that point of view of, I can't be bothered because they're all the same, you're actually part of the problem, because you are allowing for these people to actually take a stand. So what I would recommend is, if you take those issues seriously, get involved. We are probably going to have an election here in Ireland in the next 3 or 4 weeks. Be out there, go canvassing. And we've seen it, how well it can work in Ireland, because the last referendum, not the last referendum, the one before, on the Eighth Amendment, people were out in force, and it really made a difference. The referendum before that, on same-sex equality and marriage, people were out there, and it really made a difference. So political activism really matters here. And yes, it takes time and effort, but I think we have a duty. If we truly believe in equality, and democracy, we have a duty to equality, we have a duty to justice. And the way that you perform your duty is to get involved, is to be active. So when there is an election, it's a very good time to get involved. And it's not for me to say who you should get involved with, who you should vote for, but not the far right, clearly.
Thank you so much, Vittorio, for the final advice. Yeah, I think it's really important to keep in mind that taking action is also a way of changing things, because otherwise then nothing would change if you don't do anything. So thank you, Vittorio, for being here with us today, and for your very insightful take on the topic, as well as all the audience for your questions and attention. And we really hope that you would join us again in 2 weeks' time for the next topic on the housing crisis. It's called The Elephant Still Living in the Spare Room. And if you would like to send any other further comments or thoughts or questions even, do feel free to reach out to our email as elephant@stan.ie. Or you can go to the STAN website to check out our other projects, such as the Global Issues courses and Change Academy and all of that.